Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to moderate Roundtable number 3 today on sustainable development scenarios and technology futures. My name is Kevan Riahi. I'm the director of the Energy, Climate and Environment Program at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IIASA, and also one of the 10-member group members on the SDG. So this session will explore the latest knowledge and some of the key insights from sustainable development pathways or scenarios. Generally, scenarios are important because they provide us with an analytical framework in order to understand how different components of the system might interact. So they focus on systemic changes and measures that are needed, and therefore also can help us to identify solutions across multiple SDGs and how those solutions will avoid trade-offs between different SDGs, and particularly how solutions look like that would maximize synergies among them. In other words, scenarios can help us to understand how can we achieve environmental SDGs while at the same time also increasing economic and economic as well as social sustainability. And the panelists will look into those solutions with a particular focus also on poverty eradication and how can we achieve objectives like decent living for all and the different SDGs. We have four distinguished panelists comprising leading scientists in the field, but also scenario developers as well as representatives of different businesses, followed by an interactive dialogue, and then also interventions by major groups and major groups later on. Each of the interventions will be 5 minutes, and I suggest without further ado, we start with the four panelists. The first panelist is Professor Elmar Kriegler. Professor Kriegler is professor at the Professor of Integrated Assessment of Climate Change at the Faculty of Economics and Social Sciences at the University of Potsdam. He is, in addition, also the head of the research department on transformation pathways at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impacts Research in Germany, and will give us some overview of recent sustainable development pathways and related projects. Professor Kriegler, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kevan, for this kind introduction and for also framing the session. So I guess one of my key points here is that scenarios have been used extensively, as we all know, for the analysis of climate protection strategies and global pathways to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And what we see in the recent literature is that those tools and scenario approaches are increasingly also used to inform the much larger space of sustainable development targets. And this research has a few insights already. Two of them are given on this slide, where it has been confirmed that the SDG agenda is very holistic. So synergies far outweigh the trade-off between the SDGs, and therefore it's very sensible to try to reach them jointly rather than in isolation. And it would be very difficult to reach them in isolation, for example, just working on climate mitigation, but ignoring the protection of the biosphere, rather than taking both goals into account and then developing strategies that reach them jointly. One important factor in this is that there are multiple underlying transformations that we need to look at in order to fulfill all these SDG goals, those range of how we use, from how we use energy to how we use land, to how we live in cities and communities, to how we pursue human development. And you can see this transformations here on this slide. There's also reference to a paper that emerged from an international initiative called The World in 2050 that really looked at this problem of sustainable development pathways. So what is important here is systems thinking, thinking along pathways, and also thinking beyond 2030, because many of the SDGs require interventions way beyond 2030. For example, take the case of climate change. Let's move to the next slide. Could you move to the next slide, please? Or should I do that? Let's see. I don't think I can do that.
It's just a tiny slide. Sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah, my next point is, as you will see on the next slide, that it's important to talk about narratives when you do scenario building, because those narratives are an important way also to connect scenarios to stakeholders. Here we go, here it is. It is also present in the climate research arena that people think about narratives, that we know the shared socioeconomic pathways. So we have a lack of sustainable development narratives that resonate with stakeholders across in different regional contexts. And there's a project called SHAPE. You can see the web link here, which has embarked on this question of developing sustainable development narratives, different kinds, putting different emphasis. For example, you see three here: economy-driven innovation, resilient communities, and managing the global commons. And then trying to spell those out in quantitative pathway modeling, both looking at successful achievement of sustainable development goals, as well as situations where things don't reach the sustainable development goals. Let's go to my final slide. Oh yeah, now that was faster, thank you. So one example of such a sustainable development pathway that was already now assessed by the 6th assessment report of Working Group 3 of the IPCC is presented here. And the key message from this IPCC assessment, including this pathway from the literature, is that if you just look at mitigation pathways in isolation, you see a number of trade-offs in various dimensions. For example, habitat loss, so particularly on the biodiversity side, you see this here with the red bars, risk of hunger due to the increased use of bioenergy. But if you include a larger goal set and also policies, like for example, transitioning to healthy diets across the world and active pro-poor policies, then you can mitigate many of these trade-offs and increase the synergies. So this was an illustrative pathway in the IPCC assessment, and you can see a reference here. So let me conclude by saying that I think important next steps is to further consolidate this research base by encouraging broader participation, more groups participating here from more areas of the world, developing a set of compelling narratives for scenario modeling, establishing comparability of analytical and modeling frameworks. I think that's an important part to then begin with model comparisons and scenario comparisons to solidify the work, and identifying a reduced set of measurable, shared and complementary indicators to measure progress towards the SDG. So with that, let me conclude. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Elmar, for providing this overview of different pathways that show how one can achieve, for example, the climate change objective and the interactions with other SDGs. We will move to the second panelist, Professor Narasimha Rao. He's Associate Professor of Energy Systems at the Yale University in the US, and he will provide us a perspective focusing on decent living and different projections and scenarios. Professor Rao, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Yahi. It's really a pleasure and honor to have the opportunity to address this audience. The SDGs are, at their essence, about ensuring basic human well-being for all, and of course, preserving the environment for future generations to do the same. Now, at the heart of this challenge is to understand how the built environment, our material world, and how we transform it with technology affects well-being. And as this figure shows you, we can actually organize the SDGs in terms of these three components: the well-being outcomes in the middle, the environmental constraints or goals on the outside, and in between, the built infrastructure that we rely on to deliver goods and services to us and deliver well-being. Now, while scenario analysis, as we've seen in climate research, reveals a lot about how our material world and the different pathways it can take and the impacts on the environment on a global and increasingly regional scale, we are still learning about how these transformations actually deliver well-being at the individual level. That is, how do the shortfalls across the SDGs or even progress across the SDGs combine to cause or eradicate multidimensional poverty at the individual level? Next, please. You can do that twice. So the decent living standards are a framework to anchor our material consumption and our material world in our most basic needs. It's a basket of goods and services that form the material prerequisites, the necessary conditions for achieving physical and social well-being in modern society. So it includes basic amenities in the household, as you can see, that support life: shelter, adequate nutrition, water, sanitation, cold storage, as well as electronic devices that connect us to each other in modern society. But they also include services at the community scale, such as healthcare facilities, schools, and transit. And then to deliver these services at the household and community level to people requires a backbone of infrastructure, right? Roads, electric grids, industry. And we can use this framework to trace this full material impact across these scales of individual dimensions of well-being. And so we are now beginning to piece together how these decent living standards evolve around the world. Next. We now understand, we're piecing together the gaps in these living standards in countries all around the world. We know, for example, that the average number of people who lack these standards is higher than the number of income poor, as defined by different international poverty lines. We also know that the pattern of these deprivations vary across regions. So there are different development priorities in different parts of the world, even though the highest gaps, as we all know, tend to be in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. But now the most important is that we've developed in research the analytic capability to formally link well-being through these living standards to environmental impacts. So understanding the causal pathway from well-being to material use to environmental impacts. So for example, we can compare the resource needs for achieving different SDGs to each other, such as reducing malnutrition, providing everyone with safe water or access to cook stoves. And we can combine through this framework to ask questions like, how will poverty eradication, by providing people with these living standards, this basket of goods and services, would impact the environmental SDGs? So we've spent some effort, as an example, asking the question, how would poverty eradication affect energy growth and what impact would that have on climate change? Since that is a serious concern in terms of whether development is going to affect our ability to mitigate climate change. Next slide, please. And in the recent IPCC report and the summary for policymakers, we have this important finding that eradicating extreme poverty, energy poverty, and providing decent living standards to all in the context of the SDGs can be achieved without significant global emissions growth. And that's a pretty significant finding, and essentially is implying that across the world, it is really affluence rather than basic well-being that is contributing and driving energy growth and emissions. Next. If we look at the graph below, we have some insights that we can share from this kind of analysis. We see that in most regions of the world, we have more than enough energy to meet everyone's basic needs. This is the difference between the green line, which is showing you total national energy demand, compared to the black line, which is showing you the hypothetical requirements for everyone to have basic living standards. And of course, to different degrees, but even in the emerging economies and in poor countries, the total amount of energy seems to be sufficient to provide everyone with basic needs or to meet their basic needs. But the problem, of course, is inequality, that services are not evenly distributed. And so it's important to understand that we need to reduce inequality in service provision in all parts of the world. We also have other insights into understanding where growth should be targeted to have the greatest impact on well-being and at the same time grow more efficiently. So for instance, we know that prioritizing public transit and efficient public housing are the most important priorities for climate-friendly poverty eradication pathways. And this framework can be applied to other resources such as water or land, and asking the same questions. That is, if we were to ensure basic well-being, what resources would we need? Cement, steel, water, nitrogen. So this is essentially serving as a benchmark for human well-being against which the SDG progresses can be assessed, and providing us a way to link well-being more formally to environmental impacts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the contribution. We will move to the next panelist, Professor Elena Verdolini, senior scientist at the European Institute of Economics and Environment, and professor in political economy at the University in Brescia. And she will focus on R&D and digitalization dimension of the transition. Elena, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, everybody, for the opportunity to also share a few thoughts. So as K1 was mentioning, I'm going to focus on two key topics. On the one hand, innovation and technology deployment and diffusion, and then later on in the last part of my talk about actually digitalization as one of the examples where there can be significant trade-offs between achieving low carbon future and other sustainable development goals. So in terms of, contextualizing this in terms of future pathways, scenarios, and narratives, all these narrative scenarios and pathways that we use to talk about the future actually are underpinned by significant technological change and by significant innovation. For instance, in the latest years, we've seen a lot of progress in a number of low carbon technologies, and we are seeing emerging options in order to produce energy without emitting greenhouse gases. At the same time, the recent IPCC report shows that the technologies that are available are not sufficient, even if all deployed at scale, to meet all the needs in terms of emission reductions that we would have to achieve in order to reach the goals of, for instance, the Paris Agreement. So the reason why I'm saying this is that these narratives do not very often focus on what is needed in order to promote innovation to the full extent that will allow us to reach a low carbon future. What the evidence shows is that progress has been made, and progress has been made specifically in those cases when dedicated technologies push policies. And what this means is, for instance, investment in scientific training, in R&D, in demonstration. So the early phases of the innovation cycles are actually combined with tailored policies that pull the market along once the technologies are ready to be deployed at the market scale. And what these policies are, they are standards, they are feed-in tariffs, they are market for permits or taxes. And there are different combinations that have been used in practice and which have proved successful in certain cases, although it can also be said that they have not proved successful in other cases. And I will talk a little bit more in a few seconds about that. In any case, believing that innovation is tantamount to simply investing in R&D will not allow us to achieve success. You cannot just think that innovation happens, so you do need to invest in R&D, but you also have to accompany these technologies all the way through market deployment. And this is actually particularly crucial in this aspect. So just having the technology by itself market ready will not help us solve the problem. We do need to support its diffusion in the market. Also, the development of sustainable solution does require the adoption and mainstreaming of technologies that are adapted to local needs and local context. And only in this way will be possible, and it has been shown in the literature that it is possible to simultaneously address, on the one hand, the climate goal, and on the other hand, all the other sustainable development goals. And in order to do this, a necessary step is that of acknowledging that innovation is a systemic process. It has a systemic nature, so you cannot just focus on the technology per se, but you have to put into place a lot of other ancillary conditions to make the process successful in and of itself. And these conditions may vary from one place to another, from one community to another. In particular, many countries are exposed, all countries, I would say, are exposed to both, as you all know, sustainable development challenges, as well as the climate challenge. And addressing them simultaneously means that the systemic approach to innovation can help you identify the barriers in an holistic way, and can help you identify the solution which would allow you to, let's say, kill two birds with one stone, or perhaps more than two birds, given we have 17 sustainable development goals. Lastly, what I would like to say is that one specific area where it is clear that there are trade-offs between the different sustainable development goals is digital technologies. So there is a lot of frenzy and belief that these technologies can help increasing energy efficiency and in being able to manage the demand for energy, therefore contributing positively to the climate goal. On the other hand, there are several concerns, both with respect to the need for energy from the use of these technologies and the increase in services and material use that can be associated with digital solutions. But also, and most importantly, there is concern about the ability of all countries to jointly benefit about this. So linking to, I think, a comment that was made actually in the previous roundtable, people were talking about the fact that you need to promote the diffusion of digital technologies, and that is true. But it is not only that. It is that you need to close the digital divide, which is experienced not only by consumers, but also by firms, and which is not only limited to the fact that you don't have access to the technologies per se, but it also includes the fact that you may not have the skills to use that technology. And furthermore, you may, even if you have the access and the skills, you may not be able to achieve the goals and the outcomes that are desired through the use of this technology. So this is one specific example where you can see trade-offs, and where you can identify solutions to address both the sustainable development goals, or all the sustainable development goals, and the climate goal. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Elena. Let us move to the fourth panelist. After having heard three complementary scientific views, I'm particularly excited to introduce Mr. Sampo Hietanen, the CEO of MAS Global, Mobility as a Service Global, who will give us some insights from the business perspective. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's always good and bad coming after such good scientists. So since I'm a startup CEO, I just get to make bold statements with zero evidence and hope that the evidence will just pop up at some point. So bear with me. My claim in all this is that we know there are big challenges ahead. To reach the SDG goals, we do need systematic change, like many of the other panelists have said. That sometimes means we have to think out of the box. I come from mobility sector. I'm known as the guy who came up with the concept of mobility as a service. For me, it is about daring to ask the biggest questions there are. One way or another, we need to be able to ask things like this one. What would it take for any one of you to give up your own car? And I dare to say that this is actually the biggest question for the next decades, for reaching the SDG goals, but also for creating sustainable growth for the economy for the next decades, using pretty simple numbers. I come from Europe. Just for the emissions, so for the climate change, out of CO2 emissions, EU projects that by 2030 it will be 40% that is coming from that is transport related. It is the only industry that has not improved at all since the 90s. So we have to do something. But at the same time, coming from a startup, I believe in dreams of people. We cannot make big changes if we do not fulfill the profound dreams that people have. And one of the biggest ones is freedom of mobility. So we need to dare and be humble in these questions, answering that. What would it really take for anyone to give up their cars? Now, as economic growth, there's probably a lot of economists over there, and I've tried to challenge many that try to come up with a better chance for big productivity gains, which is actually the driver for sustainable economic growth. Now, this question is consuming 20% of household costs altogether. 76% of that goes into the car ownership, and that car is used roughly about 4% of the time. So as bankers, you can see that there's quite a lot of chances for this. Now, I come from the business world, so I have to try to come up with also solutions. So if you go for the next slide, and it's Friday, some of us have an evening, and the others will have late night, and then there's those of you that have that are doing just midday at the moment. But you're okay closing your eyes for a moment and trying to answer yourself, what do you think would be bigger, better, more dreamy? What will fulfill your freedom of mobility better than owning a car, a beautiful car? What if I were able to promise to you, everywhere in the world, whether you're in Helsinki, where I am, in New York, anywhere out there, that I can promise I will take you there. I will promise you will get anywhere, anytime, just on a whim, just like that. I will use all the resources that are actually out there. And we just started in Brazil, whether you are in Sao Paulo or in Mexico City, or any of those cities, we will have enough physical resources. We have public transport, we have taxis, we have all kinds of car shares, car rentals, we have micro mobility. We can actually take care of this without the car ownership. And if we do so, we stand a chance to actually do something. So if we do this, and what if our cities, where most of the people actually now live and more do, what if they're not built? The skeleton of any city now is relying on this old dream. If we go to the next one, this old dream that was actually presented year 39 in New York in the World Exhibition. It was called Futurama. And we're still living that dream. It never actually had any justification. It was just a beautiful dream of go to the moon, of saying that, hey, here's housing, here's all this, and car to connect it all. We talk about corridor policy when we should be talking about hub policy, a network policy much more, and create a new vision of the cities. And that's where I would challenge everyone to rethink in a bigger format. How will the cities, how should the cities look like after the dominance of the single occupancy vehicle? It will be pluggable, it will be walkable, it will be maybe a reclaim of the city space as we see it today. And this, I challenge every one of you to take part, because we all have to do it. The biggest challenges in this lie on the issue that the transport industry itself is big. It's I would love to say it's an ecosystem, but it's mostly an ecosystem around the world, which means that it needs a lot of roundtables like this, but it also needs strong governance from all parts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so we move now to the interactive dialogue part of our session, and yeah, I'm happy to introduce two interventions. First by Ms. Iva Brikic, a project lead and economic affairs officer at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, UNECE.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for introduction and for this. I hope it's working fine. I would like to share some findings from our current work at the UNECE. We are currently implementing a project on technology interplay under the carbon neutrality concept. And under this work, we conducted scenarios building actually with YASA, So in the next couple of moments, I would really like to share with you some findings which are relevant for our region, and I hope that they really resonate also not with just UNEC region, but the whole world. So the data from our work showed that the national actions and international climate targets set in the Paris Agreement and at COP26 really fall short delivering on carbon neutrality and limiting global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. But still, there is some silver lining, and we are still on mission possible track if we act now. And there are really achievable pathways for governments to design and implement carbon neutrality system through technology interplay. So our work really proved that carbon neutral energy system demands accelerated, obviously, phase out of conventional fossil fuels, deep electrification of all sectors through renewable energy, but also nuclear power, and widespread innovation of all low and zero carbon technologies, including carbon capture, use and storage, hydrogen, and next or new generation of nuclear power. So to attain that, the region really must to transfer technology effectively across the regions, needs to expand needed institutional capacity to support technology deployment. That is something that we identify as a main barrier, and really engage all stakeholders to create secure, affordable, reliable, and carbon neutral energy system. So the action really needs to start now and enable all zero and low carbon technologies to achieve carbon neutrality. And the governments need to first raise awareness about the merits of all low and zero carbon technologies, develop policy frameworks in support of the carbon neutrality attainment, and create a level playing field to finance a just transition towards a carbon neutral energy system. For that, of course, international cooperation will be essential, the key to build such a resilient energy system. And we really trust that UN Energy really will play a key role there. At the UNECE, we bring the table, we can provide a much needed platform for development of the rules, standards, and norms for the systemic lifestyle and infrastructure changes. But really what it's needed is international community that comes together and develops supportive policies, incentives, and regulatory frameworks to engage really technological cooperation across all sectors, no matter is it industry, buildings, or transport that we just looked at. It's really crucial that there is support in the implementation of the projects of the common interest while enabling private and public partnerships. These are some findings that we discovered from our latest work. I would like to thank all the panelists sharing their academic approach on scenarios. For the policy dialogues with our stakeholders, with our member states, we see that scenarios are really the key to enable informed policy making for our community. Thank you so much for this opportunity again.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the intervention. Let us move to Mr. Nicholas Balcom Riley. I hope, sorry if I mispronounced the name. Project researcher, Finland Future Research Center, and co-chair of the UNESCO Chair in Learning for Transformation and Planetary Futures. Mr. Riley, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to give a slightly different intervention. These past few years have felt like we are forever between moments, ones that have passed and ones that are coming and cannot be known. It has been painful, I would say, collectively to open our eyes to some of the many impacts of the vicious systems that are in our world: climate change, biodiversity loss, sexism, poverty. I would add to this racism, war. The common denominator to all of these vicious systems is that they can and do harm and kill. They're terrible. So can innovation effectively address these systems? Well, we sure hope so, right? We want that to happen, and I want that to happen. I think everybody here generally wants that to happen. So innovation, broadly speaking, is about finding new ways to do things, about finding new ways to live in relationship to our always transforming and complex world. And transformation isn't something that we get to control or manage or pull the puppet strings. It's something that we have to learn from, and it's also something we have to contribute to. But we can't really intentionally contribute to transformation when we can't recognize the potential for change in the present. We living beings of this human species, with our minds, our hands, our thoughts, and our tools, we rely on stories, like was said earlier, narratives to frame and recognize transformation and its potentiality. And scenarios are a kind of story. They're a story about the future and how those futures might come to be. And no matter how much evidence from past and present goes into scenarios, and there are very great systematic ways and rigorous ways to make scenarios, and I applaud all of them, they are always imagined stories. They're imagined futures. The future does not exist yet. We do not know. So there are many other kinds of imagined futures like scenarios, and these ones are maybe less overt and less well assembled. Some of these futures are implicit and unrecognized. Some of them are private and never said out loud, secrets. Some are explicit and widely discussed. And these imagined futures are all present in these innovation processes that we're talking about. So these futures we imagine frame how we perceive transformation. They help us notice what is changing and how, and make some guesses about what it means. And we all need to become more aware of these futures and more capable of discussing these futures and questioning them and playing with them and applying them to identify new ways of being. And in addition, we need to see novelty and appreciate difference and be willing to accept that we cannot control the future, nor should we impose our will on future people. This capability we need to develop is what UNESCO is calling futures literacy, which is part of what the UNESCO chair I'm part of is working on. In this time of crisis and precarity, this moment between moments, the SDGs are a source of much needed hope and aspiration in our world. I'm thankful to the past people who created the SDGs. Thank you, 2015 people, you were great. I propose here that innovators and scientists who have ambition to help humanity achieve these SDGs can benefit from tending to their collective development of futures literacy. And doing so can help us all launch experiments aimed to help future people and the rest of Earth's life thrive. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think we have heard really complementary perspectives from many different sides. We have two interventions now, each 2 minutes. And let me introduce first Mrs. Marlene Kanger from WFEO, a Science and Technology Major Group. Mrs. Kanger.
Thank you very much. It is a privilege to be here to make this intervention. I'm a past president of the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, the only global platform for engineering, representing some 100 nations and 30 million engineers. And I'm going to talk about some of the systemic approaches we are taking in engineering itself to advance the SDGs beyond to 2030. The UN Sustainable Development Report 2019 recognized that science and technologies are key levers to advance the 2030 agenda. Engineering is crucial to address climate change, food security, improved health outcomes, and access to clean water and energy. This has been and will always be the work of engineers. But technology alone will not deliver the changes we need. We need a paradigm shift in the way technology itself is developed and how the benefits are shared across the world, especially beyond 2030. Systemic approaches are needed for capacity and access to address our imagined futures as described by the previous speaker. Under my leadership, firstly, the Federation has transformed engineering education benchmarks, which are the systemic foundation for engineering, to ensure in future engineers are more aware of the broader implications of their extraordinary work and their responsibilities, social, environmental, and ethical, and of course, to advance the SDGs. This is the first major change since the benchmarks were first established 30 plus years ago. Secondly, we are collaborating for more engineers in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, including women engineers, because engineering education empowers and provides the equitable capacity and access to innovate, develop, and implement solutions to global challenges today and beyond 2030. Transformative leadership, systemic approaches, and sustained actions is essential for a shared future beyond 2030. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Kanga. Thank you very much. So let us go to the last, but not definitely not least intervention by Mr. Jeff Brüggemann, AT&T Business and Industry Major Group.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate. I'm going to focus on the importance of broadband connectivity and related technologies in advancing the SDGs. The pandemic has significantly accelerated our reliance on connected services, including remote healthcare, education, and work, as we're experiencing today. And as other panelists have discussed, collaboration is the key to achieving the SDGs. Through public-private partnerships to deploy next-generation broadband solutions, governments and service providers like AT&T are sharing in the costs of building, operating, refreshing networks, maximizing infrastructure investment dollars, and lessening the economic burden on communities. AT&T also is participating in public-private partnerships to provide discounted broadband services, working hand in hand with local organizations to provide essential devices and education resources in underserved communities. And these types of programs are needed to ensure no one is left behind. We also should continue to promote innovation in digital technologies like 5G connectivity, artificial intelligence, edge computing, and the Internet of Things. These technologies in turn are advancing sustainability goals by enabling people and businesses to make more energy efficient choices and by transforming every sector of the economy in developed and developing countries. So looking forward, innovative public policies are needed to provide an enabling environment for investment and new technologies across all business sectors. Because these sectors are interconnected, innovation in one area often will spark major advances in others, producing broader economic and societal benefits. A holistic and global approach is the most effective way to accelerate digital transformation and advance the SDGs. So thank you for including business in these important discussions, and we look forward to working together to achieve a better, more sustainable future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for, I would say, a set of really rich interventions and showing multitude of approaches and very different visions of how to achieve the SDGs. If I understand the time correctly, we are actually exactly at the end of our session, which was scheduled until 2:55. Right? Or is it? Or is my no? It is correct, right? So we are miraculously not at the end. So we still have time for Q&A. Sorry for being a little bit, time is up. Yeah, sorry for that. So I was hoping that we would have some Q&A, but I also thought that we have lots of speakers' interventions, which was very exciting. So thank you very much for all the contributions and for the rich interventions. Thank you very much. With that, I'm closing the session. Thank you.
Excuse me, Samia didn't get to speak.
Ah, okay. I didn't. Can the colleagues from UNDESA perhaps help me what we do at the end of time, and we still have an, please come in. Yes.
So thank you so much for that. So for this opportunity. I'm Semia Gharbi from AFG Tunisia and speak on behalf of Women Major Group. So we are working on the education, the formal education and the SDGs and for the toxic-free future. So among the 17 goals stated, so the goal 4, which relates to education, states to ensure equal access to quality education for all and promote a lifelong learning opportunities. By 2030, ensure that all students acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles. Working only on university level isn't sufficient. It becomes urgent to educate students and reinforce girls studying to respect the environment and preserve their health from the basic levels. We know that 20–30% of mortality worldwide is related to the environment from WHO. Introducing environmental practices as an integral part of the lesson in the classroom will achieve fundamental changes in and with the students, which will impact their families based on the concept think local, act global. There is an absence of social responsibility towards the environment in Africa, to which are added emerging environmental issues, climate change, water shortage, agricultural soil contamination, chemical pollution, hazard chemicals, plastic pollution, electronic waste, domestic waste, chemical in products, and so on, that directly increase the vulnerability of childhood, and particularly the girls, with the decrease of the intellectual capacities and health as the general population. Therefore, internalizing societal abusive behaviors towards the environment through the promotion of interactive actions in relation to classroom teachings is become a necessity. A project initiative implemented in Tunisia on formal education as a driver to implement and reach SDGs is running for decades now, where one teacher can reach more than 1,000 students during 6 years. Furthermore, to enhance African teachers' capacities, a project called IQRA, Education, Knowledge, Responsibilities for Africa as a duplication of Tunisian project is launched this year through Africa, starting with 3 countries, Benin, Tanzania, and Tunisia. It is therefore about improving the quality of teaching approach for teachers as far as sustainable development is concerned. So thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, and thank you so much for your intervention. I'm actually expected in another session just now to give another presentation. So sorry that we have to close this section. Thank you so much to all the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.